is Poorang Piroozfar. I'm the subject lead for the Built Environment Construction at the University of Brighton and also the course in the Architectural Technology at the University of Brighton. A little bit of background, probably I'm one of the guilty parties that basically no one mentioned. So I'm an architect by education. I've practiced as an architect and urban designer basically in the Middle East and in the UK before starting my PhD at the University of Sheffield. First came across the notion of BIM probably in 2007 towards the end of my PhD when I was visiting Penn State University, and I had an opportunity basically to do an extension about my PhD using BIM, which wasn't quite successful at that time because of the limitations of the applications that we were using, which was Revit. Then after that, around 2013, we made it work and published a paper out of it. Anyway, I'm going to use a Pareto, perhaps like principle, so 80% of my slides would take, hopefully, not more than 20% of my time, and then I will spend the 80% of time on the 20% of my slides. So this is the outline of the perhaps like talk today. So I would like to just have like an introduction, background, name on the presentation, the concept of the city as an architect and an urban planner, and setting the scene for smart cities, BIM, a little bit of touch on what we are doing in terms of BIM at the University of Brighton, and what else we've done, and some sort of discussion, hopefully, starting with a couple of questions now, and then continuing later on during the afternoon sessions. So I would just like to remind ourselves about the notion of the city. The notion of the city is quite sort of like, it's part of like a problem statement, if you like, because it's an ancient sort of notion. And whether we like it or not, we're bound to those sort of like physical limitations of the city. So these are probably some of the very early examples of what we know these days as a city, as like very early settlements, probably like dated back in around like 7,000 years ago. I did dig up a little bit like around smart city specifically, to see just what sort of notions, what sort of like concepts would come up. And this is like a sort of like word mapping, Wordle. I dug a little bit perhaps like deeper, and then came across the concept of information city quite early on, back in 1987, which was quite sort of impressive. It was a nice read. When I read it, I'm not going to just kind of like share that with you. Probably you can take time and read it if you want. But a little bit of background. So found a very interesting quote, and I would like actually put it to the audience to just have a wild guess about the roughly sort of date of this quote. When do you think it was kind of like said? By whom? I'll just leave it to later, but just an idea.
940.
Good guess.
30s. 1930s.
Good guess. So actually the idea of like wireless as we know it is probably nothing like new. Back in the days, 1926, Nikola Tesla was talking about like wireless. Found another very interesting quote, and it's not probably as ancient or old as the other one, but it's very important because it looks at the city as some sort of like previous technologies, that is extension of our bodies and minds, which is quite sort of interesting. I found it fascinating. I hope you find it the same as well. So back in 1964, Marshall McLuhan, so seeing city as a previous type of technology. So in a way, fading the boundaries between perhaps new technologies and old technologies, if you like. Obviously, we are familiar with sort of like idea of like sci-fi movies and films, and how they are trying to kind of like portray the merger of like information within our traditional set of perhaps like bodily entity of the city, if you like. And some other ones, and they're quite, perhaps some of them are quite old, so this one in here, hopefully the pointer works. Oh,
Push it.
messed up. Yeah. Okay. Quite old version of Batman, top left one, Batman back in 1920s. But probably my favorite one is a more recent TV series called Person of Interest. So when we look at perhaps like city as a perhaps like grid of information, as a smart city, we don't need to look for something which is totally and completely out of perhaps context. They can actually happen around us, and part of that is happening, whether we like it or not, with the idea of like Big Brother and watching over our shoulder, definitely. But as we probably know, in this day and age, everything is post something, if we like. So we started with like the idea of BIM, and I know that some software vendors actually probably kind of like claim that they have been perhaps using BIM for the past like 30, 40 years. But I would argue against it, not because of the sort of like their claim not being credible, simply because the technology wasn't there. Yes, we can argue that according to BIM maturity level, any sort of like communication of any sort of like nature of drawing communication is a kind of BIM. But anyway, that's not the idea. The idea is that BIM information modeling, we developed it to asset information modeling, structural information modeling, and facility information modeling. And now, these days, we are seeing concepts emerging everywhere about like city information modeling or SIM. But in parallel, perhaps another idea of like Internet of Things that I would like perhaps to focus the attention of this group a little bit more on. Internet of Devices, Internet of Places, Internet of People, and Internet of Everything. Little quiz. Speaking of Internet of Things, what was the first device you think that was connected to Internet? The first device connected to Internet?
Fridge. A fridge.
A fridge. Good guess. Quite close. Is in the same room, kitchen. It's a toaster. And that was actually back in 1990, where John Romke and Simon Hackett actually came up with the challenge put through to them by Interop Head, which was International Symposium on Internet, back in 1989. So they come up with the idea of like linking one of the Sunbeam toasters to internet and then run it through internet, control it. The things that we hear these days about Hive, control your heat from your mobile, is actually nothing new, because they could have done it through a normal sort of dial-up line, turn on and off a sort of like toaster via your link, your normal telephone line. So problem statement continued. Obviously within the city we've got the problem with generations. And as a part of the solution space, and I like quite sort of like the term solution space because it comes from industry, and BIM being BIM, trying to kind of like filling some of the gaps between construction industry and other industries, probably we need to use that term a little bit more, perhaps knowingly. So we've got computer generations and we have got mobile communication devices, different generations. But the idea of BIM, is it really new? I think it is not new, and companies like Dassault Systèmes, the French company, normally kind of like working in the area of like software, back in probably 38 years ago started with CATIA, which was probably one of the most sort of perhaps closest, I would say, idea of BIM in non-construction related industries, in aviation industry. These days, Dassault Systèmes are working with Boeing, and they're quite advanced in the idea of like BIM. Looking at other industries, car industries, specifically Formula One, have been quite advanced without perhaps even knowing anything about BIM, but they are using the concept of BIM. And they are using these days Internet of Things, and the idea of Internet of Things more and more. So, and in building industry, probably proactively, I would say, roughly over the past 2 decades or so, we've been effectively using the idea of BIM in different capacities. At University of Brighton, we have been using BIM, and we have researched BIM in different capacities in terms of research, on education, production side, combination with like mass customization. So in terms of education, what do we do at University of Brighton? Like I said, I developed the first sort of individual BIM module as probably one of the first 30 universities in the UK back in 2012 at School of Environment and Technology. And we've been teaching that ever since as an individual module, separate module. Other universities have had it before, but as more part of like it perhaps integrated to other modules. These are some examples of my students' works, and these are an example from 3 years ago of a hypothetical sort of like a land plot given to them at the bank of River Thames, basically, and they were asked to design a high-rise building with no limitation except for the height and some other very basic limitations. So no planning requirements, no nothing was required basically for them to be able to investigate and then come up with the solution. And this is an exercise which has been done over the first month of delivery at 10 credit, 1 semester module. The use of BIM in other sorts of modules. So I was talking to a colleague at one of American universities, and I was sharing with him some of these examples because we were talking about like putting some documents together for a workshop, and he said that, oh, it's good, but it's better if you use something which is not directly off the internet. So he thought actually they are just copies of examples from the internet. I said, no, these are actually my students' works samples. So these are real sort of like production of the work within the undergrad degrees, different sort of like, subject areas, University of Brighton. So is that all? Not quite, and I would like to share more sort of like perhaps, sorry, I have to go back. Yeah. These days we are probably trying to kind of like broaden the idea of BIM with different sort of technologies. And that was the basics behind the Digital Construction Lab, which was funded by the University of Brighton from QR Quality Research funding recently. And the idea was using BIM as a technological hub, link different sort of pieces and bits of technology, and then perhaps like pitching to the next step of the sort of like construction industry in 21st century. Some examples, hopefully. at San Diego City Center. Urban Project NSAD students. That's a real empty plot in Manhattan, New York. So none of these are totally and completely hypothetical projects. Thank you very much.
Okay. You can see the kind of aesthetic is moving towards the gamification aesthetic, definitely present in that. Okay, which is interesting in itself. We're going to talk about that a bit later in terms of how we can use things like Minecraft and BIM, where there's a crossover between kind of gamification and BIM itself. But before we get there, is there any particular questions for Poorang? Otherwise we can have a coffee break. I'm going to try and get the heating back on. That's all. Yeah.
Maybe just a comment. We are working with Dassault system, and there is currently a curious attempt to shift a little bit BIM in two parts. And it's curious because BIM may mean building information modeling, which is more the side of Dassault, and building information management, which would be more the side of Autodesk and actually the real leaders in the domain. And I think it's an interesting vocabulary shift because it's also an industrial strategy, but I think it's it's maybe interesting for us to think about what does this mean in the future. Are we going into more creativity, drawing, expression of dreams, gaming? That's a little bit what we are targeting in Pet Commune.
Yeah.
Or are we going into more productivity, control, the smart cities that we are a little bit fighting against?
Yes.
And you know, it's maybe a little bit caricatural, but sometimes I think there is this kind of tendency, and of course it's business models, different business models, different strategies, but it's also for us important to
Yes.
to position ourselves in this industrial directions.
Yeah. I think also one of the questions that comes up then, because we've spoken about before, Vincent, is in terms of recontextualization and recycling. Tammy mentioned it in terms of kind of building in the deconstruction within the process itself. So this is where we get this kind of, maybe that's where there is a kind of spectrum between building information modeling and information management, where the management side can also take into account questions around the deconstruction of the building itself and the repurposing therefore of the materials.
I'll add to that in terms of vocabulary. In the UK now, the UK government strategy doesn't even mention BIM. They're called product information models or an asset information model. So the whole notion of BIM has gone almost. So the next level of implementation is now called Digital Built Britain.
Digital?
Built Britain.
Digital Built Britain.
Yeah, so that's the strategy now, which has moved on from the level 2 strategy that was talked about in 2011 that was implemented in 2016. So the next thing is digital twins, Digital Built Britain, so, and they're moving away from the whole BIM thing.
Okay.
That's just the BIM tools, if you like, Revit or whatever you want to call it, are just the enablers of that. They're more interested in the information side
Okay.
and how you collect and input data once and use it many different times.
Okay. Olivier.
You spoke about ancien and that BIM was not new, but you don't look at other sector and other digitalization sector. And when I look at your present, I can remember press digitalization, edition digitalization, cinema digitalization, and company digitalization with information system. And I think at the core of this BIM is the transformation of construction and the town, and to make an intelligent system of the town, of the building. And I think it could be interesting to compare how it's happened in cinema, how it's happened in company, and so on, because now we access it experiment.
Okay, we have quite a few comments. I don't know which one are comments, which one are questions. I can probably but don't know. Shall I keep them for later? Or shall
Maybe we come back to it later. I think I'm going to try and get the heating in this building working, and we'll have a cup of coffee. We'll come back in about 10, 15 minutes if that's all right. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay.